Beneath the whisper of the wind and the soft hum of cicadas, an ancient road lies half buried under centuries of silence. Cracked stones emerge through the soil like the bones of a forgotten titan, remnants of a world that once pulsed with legions, merchants, and dreams of eternity. This was no ordinary road. It was a thread in the vast web that bound an empire together. The Roman Empire. 2,000 years ago, these stones trembled under the synchronized march of soldiers in iron armor. Their destination, conquest. Their purpose, order. From the misty hills of Britain to the deserts of Arabia, Rome's road stretched across continents, crossing mountains, rivers, and hostile lands with a precision unmatched even by modern builders. But what remains today is not just stone, it is memory. Each uneven slab carries the weight of history, the rhythm of ancient footsteps, and the quiet testimony of a civilization that refused to be forgotten. For Rome understood something profound. To rule the world, one must first learn to connect it. These roads were more than engineering marvels. They were the veins through which flowed the lifeblood of empire, troops, traders, ideas, and faith. Along them rode messages of war and peace, the edicts of emperors, and the whispers of ordinary people seeking a better life. Now, overgrown by grass and time, they lie still, but not dead. Every stone, every curve, every surviving milestone tells a story of human ambition carved into the earth itself. They remind us that progress begins not with walls, but with pathways. Tonight, we travel those forgotten roads again, tracing the rise, glory, and decay of the Roman world through the enduring lines of its greatest creation. The empire may have crumbled, but beneath the dust, its roads still lead us home.
When you see a straight line cut across a landscape where no reason of nature seems to demand it, a ribbon of granite that refuses to bend around a hill or follow the lazy curve of a river, you are looking at a decision. Rome decided that the shortest political distance between 2 points was a road. The empire did not evolve around trade routes chosen by chance. Rome created those routes. It measured, planned, and built them with a clarity of purpose that turned stone into policy. The single most famous early example is the Via Appia, laid out in 312 BCE by the censor Appius Claudius Caecus. The Appian Way began as a pragmatic military project, a firm, reliable road from Rome to the south, designed to move troops quickly to the rebellious regions of Campania. In both myth and matter, it became something else, an emblem of Roman will, deliberate, durable, visible. Within a century, the Appian Way stretched farther, and its straight, engineered line became the seed for a system that would, at its height, stitch 3 continents together. How did Rome turn a political aim into pavement? The process was part engineering, part bureaucracy, and part brute human labor, often the labor of soldiers. A typical Roman road was not simply a row of cobbles, it was a layered machine built to last. First, surveyors walked the line. The Romans kept instruments, the groma for right angles, the chorobates for leveling, and later more sophisticated tools that allowed them to translate political intention into geometric precision. They did not slavishly seek the absolute straightness that modern road engineers might prize. They sought the optimal line that balanced directness with drainage, gradient, and terrain. Where a straight line would cross a marsh, the road rose on a causeway. Where it crossed a river, the engineers built a bridge. The goal was permanence and predictability, a road that would stand through seasons and campaigns. After a route was established, work began from the ground up. The Romans dug down to firm earth, removing soft topsoil and creating a bed that would not rut. The base layer, statumen, was laid with large flat stones. Above it came the rudis, a mixture of smaller stones and mortar, compacted into a foundation. Next, a finer layer called the nucleus was added, coarse sand, crushed rock, and lime that formed a compact and water-resistant core. Finally, the pavimentum, the surface, was assembled from polygonal blocks of hard stone, often basalt, carefully fitted together like a giant jigsaw. Each stone was hammered and dressed so that the surface shed water. The road had a camber, a gentle convex curve, so rain would run into side ditches, drainage engineers in an age without modern pumps. These layers were not theoretical. They were technical solutions to practical problems: frost heave, erosion, axle wear, and the ceaseless pounding of iron-shod wheels in marching feet. Roman roads lasted because the builders understood load distribution. A wheeled cart would meet first the pavimentum, then the nucleus. The force would spread through the rudis into the statumen, and finally into undisturbed ground. The result was an economy of structure, enough material and geometry to withstand centuries of use. Labor for these monuments came largely from two sources: the legions and local labor pools. Legionaries were not professional engineers, but they were trained to follow plans, erect fortifications, and build infrastructure. When an army moved, it carried with it the capacity to transform the landscape. Soldiers raised bridges, cut embankments, and laid causeways, actions that turned conquest into consolidation. Rome also levied corvée labor from provincial populations and used enslaved people for the hardest tasks. The roads were tools of the state, and their laborers were the visible proof of that power. But construction was only a part of Roman genius. The empire paired engineering with administration. Roads were classified: viae publicae, military roads, and those under public maintenance; viae privatae belonged to private landowners, and their upkeep became a matter of law and taxation. Milestones, simple, practical, cylindrical stones, set at roughly every Roman mile, recorded distances but did more than that. They were political markers. A milestone bore the name of the official who built or repaired the stretch, often an emperor's name etched into rock across the provinces, proof that Rome's authority reached here. In the Forum in Rome stood the Milliarium Aureum, the golden milestone, the symbolic point from which the empire's distances were measured. Rome organized space by inscription as much as by stone. Along the routes, a supporting architecture arose. Mansiones were the official stopping houses, lodgings maintained for state travelers. Mutationes were change stations where a courier could swap horses. Tabernae and taverns served ordinary travelers and merchants. Roadside bridges, culverts, and milestone inscriptions were accompanied by the practical comforts of regular intervals, places to wheel off, water animals, and sleep. In wartime, these stations became strategic nodes. In peacetime, they became arteries of commerce and culture.
Roman roads were economical in another sense: standardization. Once the empire committed to a road-building program, the techniques and expectations spread. The Roman approach to width, gradients, drainage, and materials created a common physical language across diverse regions. A road in Hispania, Anatolia, or North Africa bore recognizable features: a cambered pavement, side ditches, and stone drainage, because the Romans taught their engineers to think in terms of certain performance metrics. This repeatability made administration easier and the movement of legions more reliable. Technology and technique met artistic practicality at bridge building. Romans did not merely cross rivers, they resolved them. The arch, perfected in concrete by Roman masons, allowed for bridges, aqueducts, and viaducts that combined beauty with resilience. Think of the vast arches of a pont de garde carrying water and people, an image of function transmuted into monument. Wherever a road met a gap, The Romans preferred continuity. They bridged valleys and tunneled mountains when necessary, because continuity was political as well as practical. Interrupted roads meant delayed governors, inexperienced supply lines, and vulnerable flank positions. Revenue and logistics justified the expense. A coherent road network reduced the cost of moving goods, troops, and information. Faster communication meant decisions could be made centrally with up-to-date intelligence from the provinces. The state could collect taxes more easily when couriers moved reliably. For merchants, the roads reduced risk and added regularity to supply chains. For Rome, the investment paid back in fiscal, military, and administrative terms. Yet, the building of roads also shaped the social fabric. A road created markets where none had existed, concentrated stops into towns, and encouraged the emergence of regional specialties. Along a newly paved stretch, pottery styles mixed, languages brushed shoulders, and ideas, legal concepts, religious practices, culinary techniques, moved far faster than they had before. A road was a conveyor of culture as much as of commerce. There were limits. The Roman approach favored durability over constant alteration. Where geography demanded, roads followed contours, and in hostile terrain, the builders adapted. Some regions, marshlands, dense uplands, or political frontiers, saw fewer investments. There, the Roman state balanced cost against utility. But when Rome decided a corridor mattered, the state committed thoroughly. The Appian Way's early stones were a template. As Rome expanded, builders replicated the methods, scaling up a practice until the roads were not merely local improvements, but an empire-wide fabric. From the dusty basalt of southern Italy to the paved causeways across Gallia and the engineered embankments in Africa, the same logic appeared: measure, cut, layer, tamp, and mark. Each mile was an argument about power and purpose, that Rome would be present, that Rome could be reached, and that Rome could be counted on. This was the moment when policy emerged as pavement. A magistrate's decree became a line on a map. A campaign order became a graded highway. A tax reform became a network that a tax collector could traverse. Roads turned abstract sovereignty into tactile access. They were the most democratic of imperial instruments in a sense, available to soldiers and to traders, to governors and to pilgrims. Everyone used them, and so they became a shared infrastructure of empire. Standing now on an exposed stretch of basalt, you can still read these decisions in the geometry of the lane: the straightness where a commander required speed, the gentle bend where the engineers chose to spare a settlement, the culvert where a surveyor respected the flow of a winter flood. Each choice was recorded in stone, a bureaucratic fingerprint of a polity that thought in terms of networks. In the end, building Rome's roads was a cascade of small decisions repeated until their accumulation became unstoppable. It was surveying and sweat, law and ledger, arch and axle. It was a statement that lasted longer than any emperor, that infrastructure could be the skeleton of a state. The Appian Way taught the lesson, and Rome, mile by mile, learned to be an empire not only by conquering landscapes, but by reconstructing them into roots that would, for centuries, carry the weight of a civilization's ambitions across the world.
When Rome needed to move power, it did not rely on rumor or prayer. It put its will into geometry and stone. The empire's roads were as much instruments of military doctrine as the pilum and gladius, designed to shorten time, extend reach, and transform decisions made in the capital into action at the frontier. In the climate of ancient warfare, speed was a form of violence, logistics a weapon. The Romans understood that an army that could arrive first, be supplied continuously, and communicate rapidly would win more battles than one that merely fought harder. The first and most obvious function of a Roman road in wartime was movement, the controlled, reliable movement of men and material. Unlike the tangled seasonal tracks used by earlier armies, Roman roads were engineered to perform under pressure. Predictable gradients, firm foundations, and engineered drainage meant that a legion could march where other forces might bog down. On a sustained march, a legion could manage roughly 20 Roman miles in a day, about 30 kilometers, a disciplined column covering ground with a consistency that destabilized opponents who relied on surprise. Forced marches, spurred by emergency or necessity, could extend that range, but they required precise planning. Supply wagons positioned along the corridor, spare horses at relays, and secure bivouac points at distances that matched the troops' endurance. The roads multiplied Rome's strategic options. Instead of moving piecemeal, commanders could concentrate forces quickly, shift reserves across provinces, or cut off enemy retreat. During the Republic and into the Principate, campaigns were won as much by the timeliness of reinforcement and the security of supply as by single-day engagements. The Via Appia, the Via Flaminia, and many other arteries allowed armies to pivot north, south, east, or west with predictable timing. Their straight lines were a kind of temporal map, translating distance into days and days into orders that could be decoded and acted upon. But it was not only the foot soldiers who benefited. The roads were conduits for logistics, wagons full of grain, pack animals bearing siege equipment, and specialist units such as engineers and carpenters followed the stone to fieldworks and sieges. A siege is a test of endurance. Men must be fed, machines must be built, and material must be hauled. A reliable road network turned the frontier into a mobile workshop. Siege towers, ballistae, and battering ram frames could be pre-assembled, transported, and reassembled with a speed that astonished adversaries. The durability of road surfaces reduced the attrition of wheeled transport. Axles lasted longer, wheels broke less often, and the time lost to bogged wagons shrank from days to hours. Networks of roads also created defensive depth. Forts and marching camps were not isolated knuckles of stone, but nodes on a network. A legion posted on a frontier could be resupplied and reinforced from central depots. Detachments could be shuttled to threatened sectors without lengthy improvisation. Moreover, roads shaped the siting of permanent infrastructure. Forts, castra, tended to sit on or near main routes, and watchtowers and signal stations peppered the landscape to transmit intelligence quickly. This arrangement let Rome transform local incidents into manageable, containable episodes rather than existential threats. A raid could be countered by a disciplined column moving at standard daily rates. A rebellion could be strangled by isolating it from its lines of communication. Communication, the movement of information, was perhaps as transformative as the movement of men. The message system that rode the roads developed into the cursus publicus, the imperial postal and transport service, a network of relays, staffed way stations, and couriers that could carry urgent dispatches across provinces in a matter of days rather than weeks. Imperial decrees, troop movements, and financial reports could reach commanders with a fidelity that allowed centralized control. When the emperor in Rome ordered a redeployment, he relied on the speed of couriers riding from Mutations to Mansiones. When a provincial governor reported a border incident, the capital could respond with a degree of coordination unimaginable to earlier states. Mile markers, the mundane stone cylinders set roughly every 1,000 paces, performed a political function in wartime as well as a practical one. A milestone was a ledger entry carved into the landscape. The distance to the next fort, the name of the official responsible for the stretch, often the emperor's name. In an emergency, these markers were orientation tools, a map encoded in stone. A commander unfamiliar with a province could judge progress, allocate rations, and set camp distances according to this tactile geography. In short, the stones turned terrain into legible space for logistics. Roads also enabled what we might call operational economics. Building a fortified frontier is expensive. Maintaining scattered outposts without efficient supply lines is even more so. A road network reduced per-unit cost of projection by amortizing infrastructure. Roads served multiple armies and functions, so each new campaign did not require a new logistical apparatus. The state could reuse the same pathway for tax collection, troop movement, and administrative inspection. This economic efficiency amplified military reach and made prolonged occupation feasible. Yet the roads were not merely utilitarian. They were instruments of deterrence and projection. A visible, well-maintained road signaled control. To a neighboring king or a rebellious tribe, the sight of Roman engineering slicing through their territory made abstract power concrete. It was harder to believe in the security of distance when a paved causeway glinted across the plain. Where roads ran unchecked, Roman authority was visible. Where roads were blocked or broken, authority frayed. For Rome, control of roads often meant control of minds. The technology of tactical mobility evolved alongside road building. Roman engineers became adept at rapid construction and repair. In emergencies, they could throw up a causeway, bridge a stream with temporary supports, or bypass an impassable stretch by cutting a new route. Julius Caesar's Rhine Bridge is a famous example of such military engineering. In a matter of days, his men built a timber bridge across a river long thought unassailable, allowing a punitive show of force on the far bank. The message was as much psychological as tactical. Rome could reach you whenever it chose. But the roads also delineated the limits of Roman control. In places like Germania, beyond the Rhine, the Romans pushed roads into hostile territory to create a corridor of operations and supply. In some instances, these roads worked. They allowed campaigns to press into new lands, erect temporary forts, and extract tribute. In others, they led troops into traps. The disaster of Teutoburg Forest, where 3 legions under Varus were ambushed in 9 CE, is a cautionary tale. Roman columns, traveling along narrow causeways and routes they expected to control, were funneled into wooded terrain where local knowledge and guerrilla tactics turned the network against its builders. Roads could be double-edged. They brought speed, but they also provided predictable paths that enemies could exploit when they mastered the ground. The construction and maintenance of military roads were matters of law and administration as much as engineering. The grades, widths, and required maintenance were the subject of decrees. Magistrates and provincial governors were accountable for repairs. In wartime, these responsibilities could be expedited by conscripting local labor or ordering legionary units to perform construction. The legions were not just soldiers, but also a mobile workforce. Their tents could become workshops, and their engineers could turn wood and rope into bridges and palisades. This integration reduced the lead time between conquest and consolidation. Roads were often built or repaired immediately after a territory was secured, sealing the victory's logistical gains. The presence of roads also influenced battlefield tactics. Roman commanders structured marching orders, camp placements, and scouting around the existence of these arteries. Reconnaissance along a main road was a routine duty. Securing bridges and passes became a priority. In offensive operations, commanders sought to control junctions, the nodes where roads met, because those points allowed rapid redistribution of forces. Conversely, Cutting an enemy's access to a junction could paralyze a force. Thus, the geography of roads became the geography of decision-making: where to fight, where to stand, and where to retreat. Some of the most enduring military effects of Rome's roads show up in the artifacts of supply and command. Granaries, supply depots, and way station complexes clustered along main lines of communication. Engineers designed storage systems and transshipment points where wagons would pause, goods would be inventoried, and supplies would be rationed out. These logistics hubs allowed armies to operate far from home, sustained by predictable resupply. Control of these hubs often mattered more than a single-pitched battle. Without supply, even a victorious force would wither. Yet the road's role in war was not static. As imperial policy shifted, defensive frontiers under Augustus, expansion under later emperors, or reactive campaigning during crises, the roads adapted. Some stretches that were once military highways became trade conduits in peacetime. Some frontier routes were allowed to fall into disrepair when strategic priorities shifted. The mutable use of roads illustrates their centrality. They were instruments to be deployed, conserved, or neglected, depending on imperial will. There is also a moral dimension to this story. Roads were instruments of domination that often meant the imposition of Roman order on local lives. The corvée labor used to build them, the taxes redirected to fund their construction, and the forts that followed the paving all bore heavy costs for conquered peoples. For the Roman state, these were acceptable prices for stability and revenue. For the local communities, roads could mean loss of autonomy and heavy burdens. The mobility that enabled Rome's military success was inseparable from the social changes, sometimes violent, that its presence implied. Finally, we must consider the paradox. Rome's roads made possible not only the projection of imperial power, but in later centuries, the movement of forces that would help dismantle that authority. Barbarian groups, mercenary bands, and rebel leaders learned to use Roman infrastructure for their own purposes. In the late Empire, when central control frayed and military discipline weakened, the very corridors built to bind the empire together allowed new groups to penetrate deep into Roman lands. The networks that once centralized power became routes for decentralization. Seen from the perspective of strategy and statecraft, Roman roads were more than engineering achievements. They were deliberate instruments of power, devices to shorten time, administer logistics, orient commanders, and project deterrence. They were as strategic as fortifications and as political as edicts. Their stones enabled Rome to convert distance into available options and to convert options into action. Standing now on one of those old causeways, it is possible to feel the underlying logic. The road is a calculation made visible, the decision that a state could and should invest in movement, because movement multiplies power. Where Rome built roads, it could reach, govern, and, when required, enforce. In the theater of ancient war, that capability often decided fates long before swords met shields.
When the sword had done its work and the legion marched home, something quieter moved into the space the road had opened. Carts creaking under grain, pack animals laden with oil and wine, traders bargaining in a dozen languages. The Roman road was a machine not only of command, but of commerce, a deliberate investment that turned conquest into prosperity. Where military corridors established order, trade breathed life into those arteries, and an economic system of astonishing scale grew up around pavement and milestone. Think first of the scale. Rome, with its million-strong population at the imperial peak, required food, luxuries, raw materials, and a steady inflow of cash to function. Roads linked the agricultural hinterlands to ports and cities, turning otherwise scattered production into marketable surpluses. In Egypt, the granaries of the Nile, fertile, predictable, tax-efficient, fed the capital. Grain moved from harvest to storehouse, from storehouse to ship, and from ship back to the quays where roads took over again, dispersing supplies inland. In Hispania and Gaul, olive oil and wine left villa courtyards and traveled along paved ways to ports at Baetica, Massalia, and beyond. The road transformed seasonality into supply security. Merchant classes adapted to the new logistics. The negociatores, the itinerant merchants, and the societates, proto-corporate enterprises, organized long-distance trade with a sophistication that anticipated modern commerce. They coordinated convoys, pooled capital, and underwrote risk through credit arrangements facilitated by argenteri and private bankers. The road cut the costs of transport and of uncertainty. Reduced spoilage, predictable journey times, and identifiable routes made contracts enforceable and credit safer. A contract signed in Rome could be trusted in a provincial market because the network that enforced Rome's law also ensured that couriers, witnesses, and officials could reach all points of the empire. Markets blossomed at the nodes the roads created. Roadside settlements that began as simple stopping places evolved into emporia, trade towns where local producers met itinerant merchants. At crossroads, traders from different provinces met, exchanged goods, and created hybrid economies. A Gallic potter might find Roman wine and African garum, a pungent fish sauce, at a roadside market, while local fashions and religious goods circulated back along the same routes. These exchange points were engines of specialization. Regions cultivated products for which they held comparative advantage, knowing that roads and port connections would carry their surplus to distant consumers.
Infrastructure supported this commercial ecosystem. Mansiones and mutations, created to serve official traffic, were also vital to merchants. Inns, taberne, warehouses, horea, and mule-holding yards clustered along main arteries and in port towns. Ports like Ostia and later Portus became vast transfer nodes where sea and road met. At these modal hubs, cargo moved from ship to cart to road. The logistical choreography required storage, inspection, and often repackaging. The Roman administrative machinery regulated such exchanges through tolls, tariffs, and customs posts. While taxes collected on trade funded imperial coffers, they also institutionalized predictability. Tariffs known in advance made pricing possible and reduced the opportunistic exactions that had characterized older trade routes. The variety of goods that crisscrossed Roman roads was staggering. Cereals and salted fish fed cities. Wine and olive oil lubricated diets and economies. Ceramics, glassware, and metalwork supplied daily life. More exotic commodities, spices, silks, ivory, pearls, came from distant continents via overland corridors and maritime routes that converged on Rome's ports. Silk, technically controlled by intermediaries in the east, made its way through Parthian markets and coastal trade to the Mediterranean docks. Once landed, its inland distribution relied on the same roads that carried mundane goods. The result was an economy with both mass staples and high-value luxuries, a mixture that sustained elite consumption and broad-based market activity. Legal and financial instruments evolved to match this complexity. Standardized weights and measures, widely accepted coinage, and legal protections for contracts under Roman law made transactions repeatable. The road network multiplied the reach of judges, inspectors, and tax collectors. Enforceable contracts depended on the human and institutional infrastructure that the roads allowed. In practice, a merchant could litigate across provincial boundaries because the road allowed witnesses and officials to convene. In this sense, roads were not merely physical conduits, they were the scaffolding of economic trust. Safety and predictability were crucial determinants of trade. Where roads were patrolled by troops or integrated into a system of fortified way stations, trade flourished. A caravan that could anticipate secure stops for the night, a reliable water source, and predictable markets was more likely to risk long distances. The presence of fortifications, garrisons, and the occasional roadside judiciary therefore enhanced economic activity. Corruption and brigandage declined where Roman authority was visible. Commerce increased. Conversely, where roads decayed or local authority waned, trade contracted. The road's physical state and the presence of policing were economic signals as much as military ones. Agricultural supply chains reoriented around these new logistics. Villae rusticae, rural manor farms, were nodes in the supply network, producing olive oil, wine, grain, and other staples for distant markets. Estate owners invested in production and in storage facilities designed to move goods onto roads at the right moment. The profitability of producing for export encouraged investment in land improvements, irrigations, and specialized labor. Over time, regions developed distinct economic identities. One valley might become known for fine oil, another for woolens, another for ceramics. Roads allowed these regional specialties to find markets far beyond local consumption. The road also changed consumption patterns. Urban elites in Rome and provincial capitals demanded novelty and status goods, Eastern spices, Indian gems, African ivory. These demands created long-distance value chains that in turn shaped extraction and production in far-flung provinces and beyond. Markets for luxury goods could support long expeditions, diplomatic missions, and complex trade agreements. The economic multiplier effect was real. Elite consumption supported artisans, transport workers, and brokers across the empire. But the road's economic impact was not only about long-distance trade. It reshaped local economies by lowering transaction costs and integrating hinterlands into urban systems. Shorter, more predictable transport times meant farmers could send perishable goods to market. Merchants could manage inventory with expectation rather than suspicion. The road made possible the weekly or monthly rhythm of supply that urban markets required. In short, it urbanized the countryside economically, even where formal political urbanization lagged. Monetization followed the roads. Coins minted in Rome, in provincial mints, and by local authorities circulated along these arteries, standardizing value and enabling credit. Coin hoards found near roads suggest that cash flowed where people and goods flowed. Money facilitated contracts, wages, rents, and taxes. Its circulation was a visible sign of an integrated market. The road did not just carry goods, it carried purchasing power and the instruments that make exchange possible. Trade also had social consequences. Migration and the movement of craftsmen changed demographic patterns. Skilled workers followed demand. Potters moved to regions with kiln access and road links to markets. Shipwrights and rope makers clustered near ports that fed inland roads. Over generations, cultural exchange followed trade. Culinary ideas, fashions, religious artifacts, and artistic styles spread along the same paths that carried grain. The road became a conveyor of hybridity, knitting diverse peoples into a common economic and cultural field.
Yet not all effects were positive. Economic integration exposed local producers to competition from imports. Some regions lost traditional crafts when cheaper, mass-produced goods from elsewhere undercut local artisans. Fiscal demands, taxes collected more efficiently thanks to road access, could be a burden if not balanced by market opportunities. The prosperity of provincial elites sometimes rested on extraction rather than broad-based prosperity, and economic inequality could and did widen in certain provinces. Maritime and overland routes formed a single system, and the roads integrated into that network at key ports and river hubs. The Via Egnatia, for instance, cut across the Balkans and connected Adriatic ports to Byzantium, a conduit for commerce that complemented Mediterranean shipping lanes. Riverways, too, were part of the mix. The Rhine and Danube served as high-capacity transport corridors where barges and river carts moved heavy goods to road junctions. The roads were less a single linear phenomenon than a mesh of touchpoints that let the empire harness multiple transport modes. Markets were anchored by administrative practices. Customs posts and tolls regulated flows, and imperial policy sometimes subsidized or otherwise shaped commerce. Grain dole distributions in Rome, for example, depended on the ability to move enormous quantities efficiently. The state's interest in commerce was therefore not abstract. What moved on the roads mattered for stability, for tax base, and for the capital's legitimacy. Logistics and public policy were inseparable. Finally, the image of the road as a corridor of prosperity must be tempered by the labor that fed it. Behind every cargo of oil, grain, or silk were workers, field hands, dockers, muleteers, craftsmen, and the enslaved. The road enabled wealth accumulation, but also mediated social relations and hierarchies. Trade made a few rich and many dependent. It created opportunities and dislocations. These tensions were part of the economic reality of the Roman world. When we walk a Roman causeway today, the faint grooves worn into basalt by centuries of wheel traffic are a silent ledger. They record not only the march of legions, but the passage of cartwheels carrying the goods of daily life and the luxuries of kings. The empire's wealth was not conjured in marble palaces alone. It moved along roads, mile after measured mile. The quiet trade that followed conquest turned stone into market, and markets into civilization.
Stone does not only carry wheels. Over centuries, the same paved lines that moved grain and legions carried songs, sermons, laws, and prayers. Roman roads were, in other words, arteries of meaning as much as of material goods. The literal paths through which cultures met, collided, hybridized, and ultimately reshaped the map of belief itself. In this section, we follow those quieter currents, how the road spread language, law, ritual, and faith, and how the world that emerged was as much a cultural construction as an imperial one. Begin with language. Romanization was no accident. When Rome planted veterans or merchants along a freshly paved corridor, they brought Latin with them. Latin began as the language of the city, but the road turned it into the lingua franca of administration, trade, and civic life. Couriers and clerks wrote in Latin on milestones and petitions. Magistrates issued edicts in Latin that could be read in provincial fora. Merchants negotiated contracts using formulas standardized by Roman law. Over generations, contact zones along roads became bilingual or multilingual marketplaces where vernacular speech mixed with administrative Latin. That mixture is the ancestor of the Romance languages, of Italian fields, French towns, Spanish plazas, and Portuguese coasts. In many regions, the cadence of modern speech still reflects the motion of ancient carts and caravans. Vocabulary for trade, legal practice, and urban life arrived along the same stones that carried amphorae and marble columns. Roman law moved along these same lines. The highways were not merely physical, they were institutional. Legal concepts, property, contract, will, municipal governance traveled with magistrates, jurists, and clerks who used the roads to inspect, adjudicate, and teach. The emperor's edicts and provincial statutes were circulated through the cursus publicus, the imperial postal service, ensuring that the language of law could reach distant courts. Towns that sat on major routes maintained local magistracies and public records precisely because the road connected them to Rome's administrative orbit. The mobility of jurists mattered. Law teachers lectured in provincial cities, students traveled to centers of legal learning, and manuscripts of legal commentaries circulated via merchants and officials. Later codifications, the Theodosian compilations, and the legal heritage preserved in the Eastern Roman world were effective only because the institutional muscles that sustained them were already trained on the network of roads. Religion, perhaps more than any other cultural form, illustrates how roads transmuted imperial infrastructure into personal conviction. Before Christianity's ascent, Roman highways carried temples, shrines, and the worship of localized deities. The Roman approach to religion often incorporated rather than obliterated. Conquerors identified foreign gods with Roman equivalents in a practice scholars called interpretatio Romana, and temples to the imperial cult dotted the same routes as shrines to local spirits. A traveler along a single road could pass within a few miles from a sanctuary to a mystery rite to a public altar where municipal sacrifices were performed, a kaleidoscope of ritual life that reflected local identities nested within imperial frameworks. Into this plural religious landscape arrived Christianity, initially one voice among many. The movement of early Christians depended heavily on the existing infrastructure. Apostles and missionaries used the sea lanes and roads to reach synagogues and marketplaces where debate and proselytism could take root. Paul's journeys, famously combining sea passages and overland segments, made frequent use of the connective tissue the empire provided, showing that early missionary strategy was as much logistical as theological. As Christianity spread, roads enabled the rapid establishment of episcopal networks. Bishops traveled to councils, carried letters between communities, and exercised jurisdiction across dioceses that were often defined by existing administrative and transport geography. A poignant symbol of this shift lies along the Via Appia itself. Outside the gates of ancient Rome, in the soft volcanic soil, Christians carved vast catacombs, subterranean cemeteries and places of memorial that lay within easy reach of the road. For the persecuted, the road provided both escape and access, discreet meeting places for worshippers, routes for clandestine movement, and pathways by which martyrdoms and cults of saints became known across provinces. As Christianity won imperial favor under Constantine in the early 4th century, a political turning point marked by the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, the same corridors that had once carried pagan priests and pagan processions now bore bishops in embroidered robes, relics in silver reliquaries, and constructions of basilicas that borrowed from Roman civil architecture. The architectural vocabulary of faith offers a subtle testament to the road's work culturally. The basilica, originally a public hall for law and business, became a church form suited to large congregations. Its adoption was practical, symbolic, and convenient because many basilicas were located at urban nodes tied to road junctions. The same structural mastery that had built bridges and fora thus provided a template for sacred space. Mosaics, frescoes, and sculptural programs, methods and motifs developed in one province, traveled along arteries and influenced mosaicists and masons in others. The decorative programs of churches and villas reveal the same cross-pollination that trade did. Pagan iconography was reinterpreted, classical motifs reinscribed with Christian meaning, and regional styles blended into new visual languages. Pilgrimage turned roads into ritual circuits of devotion. From an early period, Christians and adherents of other faiths used the road to visit holy sites. Rome, with its tombs of apostles and martyrs, attracted pilgrims who could follow the paved ways to shrines and basilicas. Jerusalem, though more distant and often reached by sea, connected to inland approaches that relied on overland corridors, the routes that linked ports to mountain passes and holy precincts. Over the centuries, medieval pilgrims walking the Via Fregina to Rome or the paths to Santiago de Compostela derived much of their route logic from older Roman alignments. The physical habit of pilgrimage, a slow, embodied travel that transformed the pilgrim through discipline and encounter, was possible because roads made long-distance movement legible and survivable. Hostels, hospices, and monastic way stations sprang up near these corridors, offering rest and hospitality in exchange for alms and prayers. Monasteries and monastic networks became important cultural nodes linked by roads. Soon after the imperial age, monasticism expanded across the landscape, and monks used the same roads to found houses, exchange manuscripts, and teach. Scriptoria in monasteries copied texts, religious, philosophical, and scientific, and roads moved those manuscripts from library to library. The survival of classical learning in the medieval West owes a great deal to these networks. Books are portable, but only within systems of safe passage and patronage that roads help to provide.
Art, too, rode the roads. Pottery styles and iconographic trends diffused with surprising speed. Workshops near major routes adopted and adapted fashions seen on the other side of the empire. Mosaicists in North Africa referenced mythic motifs circulating through Mediterranean commerce, while marble carving techniques from the eastern provinces informed statuary in southern Italy. Artists traveling as artisans or in retinues worked on commissions far from home. Masters carried patterns, apprentices, and tools along the same stones that carried marble. This movement created regional hybrids. A North African saint depicted with the iconography of a Syrian martyr, a Roman funerary relief reworked to include Christian symbols, syncretism visually recorded in stone, tessera, and pigment. Educational life followed the lines of the road as well. Cities on major routes housed schools of rhetoric, law, and medicine that attracted students from both nearby and distant communities. The Berytus Law School in the eastern provinces, for example, became a center where jurists from across the Mediterranean gathered. Roman roads and sea connections enabled that reputation. Rhetoricians and teachers traveled to appointments or touring circuits. Their pedagogy spread through public oratory and private tutoring, and literacy spread along with the demand for legal records, letters, and contracts. The cultural consequences of these movements were not only additive, but also transformative. Local cults adopted Roman patronage. Local elites imitated Roman civic architecture. Provincial gods received Latin epigraphs. New religious festivals emerged that blended Roman calendar forms with local practice. In cities and towns along roads, municipal life gained a Roman face. Forum buildings, curial houses, and basilicas anchored daily urban rhythms. The shared language of urbanism, streets, baths, and theaters made people feel they were part of a broader civic project. Roads therefore taught towns to think and aspire in a Roman key, and that training proved durable even after imperial power faded in many places. But the cultural traffic was not unidirectional. Roads also carried resistance, subversion, and alternative identities. Local languages and forms persisted and reasserted themselves. So-called Roman religion was frequently localized. Gods absorbed local attributes and festivals. Christianity itself incorporated local customs as it spread, which allowed it to flourish in diverse settings. The road, therefore, functioned as a channel for negotiation as much as for instruction. It forced encounters, and those encounters produced compromises, adaptations, and new syntheses. Finally, these cultural movements had an emotional dimension. For ordinary people, the road could be a line of departure or return. A young farmer's son recruited into the army and sent to a distant fort. A merchant's daughter married into another province.
a pilgrim walking for penance or hope. The road framed life's major transitions. Monuments, milestones with carved names of emperors, and inscriptions recording municipal benefactions all served as public memory, fixings of personal and communal histories onto durable stone. The roads made experience communal and mobile. They turned private journeys into public narratives. Standing on a surviving causeway at dusk, a traveler might feel the residue of these stories, the echo not only of marching boots, but of sung psalms, legal proclamations, marketplace bargaining, and whispered prayers. The road is a palimpsest of human speech and practice. Each mile contains layers of belonging and estrangement, meaning and contestation. It is no accident that when empires shift, cultures persist in the lines that connected them. The Roman road was not merely cement for carts. It was a channel through which the empire taught towns to be Roman, clergy to be organized, merchants to be confident, and pilgrims to be persistent. In this sense, the pavement did the slow, patient work of culture building. It carried the vectors of language, law, ritual, and art until old geographies became new worlds.
There is a moment, standing on a windswept ridge in northern Britain, when the illusion of eternity breaks. The road that once stretched straight and sure now fades into marshland. Stones end abruptly. Grass reclaims geometry. Here, at the limits of the Roman world, the road becomes something else. Not an artery of empire, but a scar across the edge of civilization. For centuries, Roman engineers had drawn lines of connection, but on the empire's frontiers, they also drew lines of division, the boundaries between order and wilderness, between civitas and chaos. These were not merely borders of geography, but of imagination. The edges of empire were where Roman confidence met the unknown, and yet Rome did not retreat from the unknown, it paved it. From the Atlantic to the Euphrates, the Roman network expanded like a web spun outward from the heart of Italy. Roads like the Via Claudia Augusta climbed the Alps into the Germanic forests. The Via Domitia sliced through Gaul to Spain. The Via Nova Traiana traced the desert edges of Arabia. Each road carried not just legions, but the frontier itself, the living boundary that advanced with every milestone. The historian Cassius Dio once wrote that Rome's roads ended only where courage failed. Yet in truth, courage had little to do with it. The roads ended where empire ceased to be profitable, where distance, resistance, and cost outpaced the value of control. Still, to walk those frontier roads was to see Rome's genius stretched to its limits. Paved highways gave way to gravel tracks, which in turn vanished into dirt and dust. But even at their roughest, the Roman standard persisted. The surveying lines, the drainage, the milestones, the logic of reach. The Via Egnatia, running across the Balkans, was one such line of reach, an eastern highway connecting the Adriatic ports to Byzantium. It was the empire's spinal cord, carrying troops to face the Parthians, traders to Asia, and pilgrims to Jerusalem. To the west, in Gaul and Britain, the same purpose repeated in stone. The Watling Street and Fosse Way in Britain were not simply military conveniences, they were the tools by which a distant island became a Roman province. But nowhere is the drama of Rome's edge more visible than in northern Britain, where the road meets the wall. In 122 CE, Emperor Hadrian ordered the construction of a barrier unlike anything the Romans had built before. Stretching 80 Roman miles across the width of northern Britain, from the River Tyne in the east to the Solway Firth in the west, Hadrian's wall was not a single structure, but an ecosystem, a frontier of stone, turf, ditch, and road. Running parallel to the wall was the Military Way, a paved service road that linked forts,
mile castles, and watchtowers along the length of the frontier. The wall itself was a statement of psychology as much as of defense. It declared, "This far and no farther." But the military way told a subtler story. It allowed soldiers, supplies, and messages to move rapidly along the line. Garrisons could be reinforced within hours. Reports could flow to command posts, and the rhythm of inspection never stopped. The road made the wall more than a static fortification. It made it alive. The fortresses along Hadrian's Wall, like Vindolanda, Housesteads, and Bertiswald, depended on the road. Archaeological finds from Vindolanda include writing tablets, personal letters, and inventories that make vivid the daily life of the frontier. Orders for beer, requests for socks, love letters to distant families. These fragile documents, preserved by mud and time, are whispers of humanity sustained by the system beneath them, the road that linked each fort to Rome itself. To the soldiers stationed there, the world beyond the wall was a different planet. North lay the lands of the Caledonian and Picts, untamed tribes whose freedom seemed both barbaric and enviable. The road marked the divide between empire and wilderness, between disciplined grid of Roman order and the open chaos of nature. And yet, the wall was porous. Traders, interpreters, and even families crossed it daily. Markets sprang up at its gates. Peaceful tribes sold cattle, hides, and slaves. The frontier road became not just a military route, but a corridor of exchange, a place where empire and barbarian met, traded, and quietly influenced one another. East of the Rhine, the Roman project faltered against a different kind of resistance, not just tribal, but topographical. Germania was a land of forests, swamps, and shadows. The Roman historian Tacitus described it as a land hostile to the plow and the sun alike. Yet Rome tried to pave it anyway. The Limes Germanicus, a vast frontier system running from the Rhine to the Danube, was accompanied by roads that stitched together forts, watchtowers, and supply depots. These were the arteries of an empire holding its breath, straight where possible, pragmatic where not, and always under the watchful eye of the legions. The Via Claudia Augusta, begun under Augustus and completed under Claudius, was one such marvel. It connected northern Italy to the Danube frontier, allowing supplies to flow through alpine passes that earlier peoples had considered impassable. The road's paving stones, still visible today, bear the marks of carts that once carried iron, wine, and soldiers toward the frontier. But the road also invited danger. In 9 CE, the Roman commander Varus led 3 legions along a frontier route through the Teutoburg forest. Ambushed by Germanic tribes under Arminius, the legions were annihilated. Their standard-bearers fell in the mud, their bodies left unburied, their road swallowed by forest. Rome's reach had met its limit, not in stone, but in overconfidence. After Teutoburg, Rome built roads more cautiously. The empire learned that not every path could be paved, that some landscapes resist geometry. Still, even retreat did not mean abandonment. Roads became observation lines, allowing patrols to monitor the borderlands, traders to move cautiously between tribes, and information to flow where conquest had failed. To the south and east, the frontier looked entirely different. Here, the challenge was not forest, but void.
Across the sands of North Africa and Arabia stretched roads built for endurance rather than expansion. The Via Nova Traiana, constructed under Emperor Trajan around 111 CE, ran from Bostra, in modern Jordan, to the Red Sea port of Isla, Aqaba. It threaded through a landscape of sun and silence, connecting military outposts that guarded the empire's trade with Arabia, India, and the Horn of Africa. Every 30 to 40 kilometers, a day's march, the road reached a fort or water station. Cisterns carved into rock stored precious rainwater. Milestones stood like sentinels in the sand. The engineering was austere but precise. Stone paving where terrain allowed, compacted gravel elsewhere, and markers carved in Latin even where Latin was never spoken. For the caravans that passed through, the road was lifeline and symbol alike. Nabatean merchants, Roman soldiers, and local nomads all used its path. Spices from India, incense from Yemen, gold from Nubia, all flowed northward, carried by camels and measured by milestones. The Via Nova Traiana made the desert speak Latin. But these frontier roads were more than economic. They were Rome's declaration that no terrain was too hostile, no environment too alien. The road in the desert was not merely a route. It was an act of defiance against nature itself, proof that Rome's order could be imposed on emptiness. In North Africa, the empire's roads were both instruments of power and threads of prosperity. From the coastal cities of Carthage and Leptis Magna, roads reached deep into the hinterland. The wheat fields and olive groves that fed Rome's people and legions. The Via Traiana Nova Africa and other regional roads bound the province together, allowing administrators to tax, merchants to trade, and legions to patrol. Farmers brought grain to depots, which in turn supplied ships bound for the capital. Archaeologists have found milestones across modern Tunisia, Algeria, and Libya, bearing imperial inscriptions, built by order of the emperor. Each stone is a small proclamation of control, Rome's voice carved into the skin of Africa. And yet, like in Britain, the frontier here was alive with exchange. Nomadic tribes traded livestock and salt for Roman goods. Some joined the Roman army as auxiliaries. Others settled along the roads as herders and craftsmen. Over time, these contacts bred not just commerce, but culture, a blending of Latin, Punic, and Berber elements that would long outlive the empire itself. In Europe's center, the Danube frontier formed the empire's most dynamic edge. Along its northern bank ran one of the longest continuous military roads in the ancient world, connecting forts from Germania to Dacia to Musia. This Via Militaris allowed rapid troop movement along the river, but it was also the empire's northern marketplace. The Danube's road linked Roman towns like Carnuntum, Sirmium, and Singidunum, modern Belgrade, creating a chain of urban life facing the barbarian north. Here, soldiers, merchants, and settlers lived side by side. The frontier was not a wall, but a membrane, a place of permeability, where trade, diplomacy, and occasional conflict all coexisted. Amber from the Baltic, furs from the Carpathians, and slaves from beyond the river all flowed southward. Roman wine, pottery, and coins went north in return. Over centuries, the Via Militaris became both lifeline and fault line. When the empire was strong, it represented control. When it weakened, it became the invasion route, the same road along which Gothic and Hun forces would one day march toward Rome. To live on a frontier road was to live with tension, between safety and danger, identity and ambiguity. Soldiers stationed on the borders often spent decades away from Italy. They married local women, adopted local customs, and fathered children who spoke both Latin and the native tongue. These families formed hybrid communities, Roman in form, provincial in soul. Temples blended deities. Altars bore inscriptions to Jupiter and to local gods. Pottery, jewelry, and funerary art all reveal a cultural fusion born of the frontier's constant exchange. Roads were the medium of that fusion. They brought news, fashions, coinage, and authority, but also myths, gossip, and rebellion. Bandits haunted remote stretches. Traveling entertainers and merchants followed the soldiers. Itinerant craftsmen repaired armor, carved statues, and brewed beer. At night, torches flickered along the watchtowers, and travelers gathered at way stations. Merchants from the East, soldiers from Africa, slaves from the Balkans, and nomads from the desert, all sharing a fire under the same indifferent stars. Rome's roads to the frontier were more than infrastructure. They were statements about the empire's self-image. In building them, Rome was saying, "We will define the world's shape." Each paved mile pushed the boundaries of Roman identity outward. Yet the farther the roads reached, the more they confronted the empire with its own limits. Beyond the wall, beyond the river, beyond the desert, there were always others who lived differently, thought differently, and refused to be absorbed. Thus, the roads of the frontier became metaphors for Rome itself, stretching between civilization and wilderness, ambition and humility, permanence and decay. The edge of the empire, once defined by stone and sword, became the seeds of new worlds. By the 4th and 5th centuries CE, many frontier roads had begun to crumble. Garrisons were withdrawn, milestones toppled, bridges washed away. Yet even in ruin, the roads remained. Barbarian tribes, Goths, Vandals, Franks, followed the same routes inward that Roman armies had once marched outward. The highways of empire became the corridors of its dissolution. But the frontier's legacy endured. The towns, markets, and cultures born along those roads did not vanish. They evolved, some into medieval cities, others into enduring cultural crossroads. The edges of empire, once defined by stone and sword, became the seeds of new worlds. If you walk today along the remains of the Via Claudia Augusta, or stand atop Hadrian's Wall, the silence is deceptive. Beneath the stillness lies the pulse of a vanished order. Here, where empire ended, civilization did not. The frontier roads were Rome's most human achievement, not because they conquered, but because they connected. They were not just lines of power, but of encounter. Places where soldiers became settlers, strangers became neighbors, and the edges of the known world became bridges to the unknown. The roads to the frontier remind us that every boundary is temporary, every empire finite. Yet what endures, long after marble crumbles and banners fall, are the lines we draw to reach each other. And in that sense, the edge of the Roman Empire was not the end of civilization. It was the beginning of everything that came after.
There is a particular silence that speaks of abandonment, the stillness of a road no cart crosses, the deepening of ruts unkissed by wheel iron, the toppled milestone half swallowed by brambles. For centuries, Roman roads were the empire's pulse, a measured cadence of commerce, law, and military order. but the pulse can falter. In the late antique world, the great network that Rome had engineered with such care began to show the symptoms of systemic stress. Stones that once rang under marching boots grew loose, culverts clogged, bridges fell. The decline of Rome's roads was not a single catastrophe, but a long, uneven process, a mirror of political fracture, fiscal strain, social change, and shifting human priorities. The story of that unraveling starts with money. Roads don't maintain themselves. Drainage must be cleared, pavements must be relaid, bridges must be rebuilt after spring floods. The Roman solution had always been organizational as much as technical. Legal obligations, municipal levies, imperial grants, and the legion's labor. In stable centuries, those mechanisms fed routine upkeep. But from the 3rd century CE onward, the empire faced a cascade of crises that drained the state's capacity. A prolonged cycle of military pressure, political instability, and economic dislocation meant fewer resources for infrastructure. When emperors scrambled to fund armies, pay mercenaries, and prop up currency, paved roads slipped down the ledger. Military exigency both propped up and hollowed out the network. Efforts to secure frontiers often required rerouting funds to fortifications rather than routine maintenance of transit routes. New priorities, mobile field armies, fortified cities, and watchful garrisons altered how money and manpower were used. Ironically, some roads were improved in the short term because of specific campaigns, but the broader pattern was one of uneven investment. Strategic corridors saw attention, provincial byways did not. Over time, this selective maintenance created gaps in the network, stretches of reliable pavement interrupted by lanes that fell to mud and bramble. Administrative change deepened the problem. The empire's political reorganization, Diocletian's tetrarchy, Constantine's foundation of a new eastern capital at Constantinople, and the later bifurcation into Western and Eastern administrations altered lines of fiscal responsibility and attention. The Western administration, particularly after the sackings of the early 5th century and the fragmentation of central authority, could not sustain the old Roman systems. The cursus publicus, the imperial communication and transport service that had been the circulatory system for government, shrank where provincial treasuries were broken, and postal relays that had once moved edicts and revenues in days slowed to weeks or ceased altogether in damaged regions. With bureaucratic arteries compromised, practical upkeep of roads became a local problem that many towns could not afford. The changing economy accelerated the decay. The later Roman world experienced a shift in trade networks and production. Long-distance luxury trade with India and the East continued in some channels, but regionalization increased. Urban populations shrank in many Western cities. Agriculture retreated into more localized, subsistence-focused patterns known as ruralization or villa economy transformation. Where markets contracted, the incentive to maintain long-haul routes diminished. Merchants and landowners directed their efforts to nearer markets and local roads, tracks that might be passable in dry seasons but lacked the engineering permanence of the imperial highways. The Roman road, designed to sustain empire-scale movement and administration, found fewer users to justify its upkeep. Violence and insecurity also played a major role. The later centuries were punctuated by incursions, migrations, and the breakdown of central policing. Banditry rose in neglected stretches, making long-distance travel more risky and more expensive. In some regions, roads that once connected lively provincial towns came to link abandoned vicus and shuttered markets. When travelers feared ambush, they shortened journeys and concentrated movement along better defended corridors. Marginal roads were left to rot. What remained were spine routes with dense military presence and a tangle of forsaken byways where nature reclaimed Roman order. Material practices changed too. Stones are valuable. As central control weakened, communities repurposed durable materials from roads and public buildings for new needs. Milestones and paving stones were quarried and reused for local houses, fortifications, and churches. An astonished medieval traveler or a later peasant reusing a well-cut block for a hearth could hardly be blamed. Durable building material was scarce. The very permanence that made Roman roads monuments to engineering also made them convenient quarries. Over centuries, entire stretches of pavement could disappear, not because the road crumbled away, but because its stone entered the fabric of later settlements. Environmental and climatic factors played their part in quieter ways. Floods undermined bridges, sedimentation filled culverts, and cycles of wet and dry seasons exacerbated frost heave and erosion in marginal regions. Maintenance demands multiply under changing conditions, and with fewer hands to clear drains and mend culverts, small faults became structural failures. In some river valleys, silted channel courses made old bridges obsolete. In marshy regions, causeways settling into peatlands could warp beyond simple repair. These gradual processes compounded the administrative and social failings, turning small defects into unbridgeable chasms. Yet decline was not uniform. In the Eastern Empire, where administrative continuity and fiscal resources remained stronger, many roads retained function long after their Western counterparts decayed. Constantinople, as a new political center linked to Anatolian and Balkan networks, invested in roads, bridges, and the cursus publicus. In the countryside, bishoprics and monastic communities sometimes maintained local stretches to ensure pilgrimage, pastoral supply, and ecclesiastical administration. But even where maintenance occurred, it often took a different logic. Religious importance, strategic necessity, or local wealth, not imperial design, determined which roads lived on. The human consequences were tangible. The slowing of couriers meant slower administration, delayed troop responses, and anew frictions in governance. Tax collectors arrived later, markets were less regular, and ordinary people adjusted their expectations and behaviors. Travel became more episodic. Journeys were planned with greater caution and contingency. The social rhythms that had relied on predictable movement, markets, festivals, civic inspections, slackened. Towns that had depended on passing trade withered. Others adapted by refocusing on local production or on particular niches such as pilgrimage, which could still draw long-distance visitors despite broader decay. In this period of contraction, new patterns of settlement and communication emerged. Fortified towns, often located at crucial road junctions or river crossings, grew into survival centers. The protective logic of walls and defensible sites reasserted itself. People moved inward to safer nodes and away from exposed vici and villae. The old imperial landscape of widely distributed infrastructure compressed into a map of nodes. Early medieval urban centers that inherited Roman origins but were adapted to a different political and economic reality. Roads that connected those nodes were maintained selectively. Everything between them changed status from highway to hinterland.
The cultural meaning of roads shifted as well. Where once milestones bore the emperor's name as a sign of imperial reach, later inscriptions often reflected local patronage or ecclesiastical benefaction. Christian communities repurposed roads in new symbolic frameworks. Processional routes to shrines, pilgrimage pathways, and routes to monastic centers acquired sacred significance. Thus, the physical decay of imperial roads did not erase their symbolic force. Rather, it transformed it. The same stones that had once proclaimed emperors now bore the weight of saints and abbots, and the road's meaning migrated from political dominion to religious memory. Archaeologists reading the layers of late antiquity see all of these processes in the field record. They find pitted pavements, patched causeways, and bridge repairs made with whatever materials were at hand. In some sites, there is evidence of continuity. Stepped repairs, reused stones, intermittent maintenance funded by a local elite. In others, the pavement simply ends. A modern farmer's wheel rut follows a line where Roman stones once lay. Milestones toppled and reused appear in village churches. Way stations became farmhouses. The landscape keeps testifying to both continuity and collapse. The final collapse of centralized authority in the West did not mean an immediate disappearance of roads. Rather, networks continued to be used in improvisatory ways. Barbarian federates and successor kingdoms used Roman corridors for movement. Gothic, Vandal, Frankish, and other polities adapted what remained useful. Over time, these groups developed their own administrative practices, and medieval polities, whatever their origin, began to build and maintain the communications necessary for their governance. But the scale, standardization, and bureaucratic integration of the Roman system were gone, replaced by local logic and regional priorities. This long disillusion left legacies that would shape Europe for centuries. The contraction and selective survival of roads reorganized economic space, contributed to the formation of new political centers, and conditioned the roots of medieval commerce and pilgrimage. Some Roman roads became the spines of medieval trade. Others vanished entirely, only to be rediscovered by curious travelers centuries later. Where pavement survived, it often anchored urban continuity. Where it did not, landscapes could shift dramatically, following new paths of water, soil fertility, or political security. The emotional arc of decline is not only of loss, but of transformation. Stones turned into thresholds for new communities, milestones became building blocks for churches, abandoned causeways became footpaths lined with hedgerow. The Roman network, though wounded, seeded subsequent forms of connection. Even in disrepair, it continued to orient the imagination. Maps copied old alignments, local memory preserved names and references, regional customs retained the imprint of centuries of mobility. Standing on a once paved stretch now grown wild, the viewer feels both melancholy and a kind of awe. The silence is full of histories. Decisions not taken, repairs postponed, the slow arithmetic of empire unmade by time and circumstance. But there is also continuity. Small, stubborn, human. Shepherds still use the hollows. Pilgrims still follow faint lines. Stones reused in village walls preserve a tactile link to an earlier order. The road may have faltered, but it did not vanish into oblivion. It reshaped itself into the palimpsest of later ages, a landscape that remembers empire in fragments, a geography of decline that nevertheless carries the seeds of renewal. In the end, the decline and disrepair of Rome's roads is a story not of sudden ruin, but of a long folding, an administrative unraveling, economic reorientation, and cultural reconstitution. The empire's arteries did not all snap at once. They frayed, rerouted, and recombined. And as the stones sank and the milestones were lifted into new walls, the human enterprise continued. Civilizations fall, but pathways endure, sometimes in their original form, often reworked, always repurposed. The road's decay is therefore also a bridge between the imperial past and the medieval world that would inherit, adapt,
and ultimately reinvent the very idea of connection.
When a road refuses to die, it does so in small, stubborn ways. A line of cobbles visible where a plow turned last century's field. A dusty lane that aligns exactly with a Roman milestone, now embedded in a church wall. A village market that still sits at a crossroads first chosen 2,000 years ago. The Roman road network was not merely stone and mortar. It was a pattern, a set of choices about where people could meet, trade, pray, and govern. And patterns, once set into a landscape and into human habit, have a way of surviving long after the institutions that made them have vanished. The story of these surviving lines begins immediately after the political collapse of the Western Empire. When central authority fragmented, people did not abandon movement. They still went to markets, still visited shrines, and still needed to carry grain and salt. The Roman pavements, bridges, and causeways that remained passable became the skeleton for new journeys. Sometimes the paved surface survived intact. More often, the logical line of travel did. Villages grew where roads crossed rivers, where bridges still stood, and where fortified sites had been located. Those nodes, once Roman way stations and forts, became medieval towns, and their streets often preserved Roman geometry in their plan. Pilgrimage was one of the most powerful forces that kept old roots alive. When Christianity became dominant across Europe, religious movement generated a steady flow of human traffic. Pilgrims, relic processions, and clerical circuits all required reliable passage. Roads that had connected imperial markets now connected holy sites. The same Via Egnatia that had ferried soldiers and merchants toward Byzantium later conveyed pilgrims and clerics. In the West, Roman alignments influenced the pilgrim arteries to Rome and to Santiago de Compostela. Walkways that later medieval maps and itineraries preserved mirror earlier imperial routes. Pilgrims traveling long distances preferred established tracks with way stations and hospices, precisely the infrastructure that Roman roads, even in partial repair, could offer. Monasticism played a similarly conservative role. Monasteries depended on movement. Novices and books traveled, relics were exchanged, and bishops made circuits. Monastic houses often maintained the stretches of road nearest to them for pragmatic reasons, to ensure supply and access, and through their scribes they preserved maps, itineraries, and local knowledge about routes. Monastic cartularies sometimes recorded the existence of bridges, rites of passage, or obligations to keep a causeway clear. This administrative memory mattered. Even when imperial bureaucracies evaporated, local institutions kept track of what the land required to move people and goods. Material reuse gave the roads another afterlife. When the paving stones of a road became a convenient source of dressed rock, local builders repurposed them for churches, manor houses, and defensive walls. Builders seldom lacked practical reasons. Recut stones saved time and labor, and well-dressed blocks from a Roman pavement fit perfectly into a new foundation. Over centuries, whole stretches of Roman pavement disappeared into village fabric, stones finding second lives as lintels, fonts, or cornerstones. This cannibalization was not annihilation. It redistributed the road into the vernacular architecture of later societies. The Roman road was not erased so much as transmuted into new forms. Trade was another continuator. As medieval economies matured, the arteries that connected production centers to ports re-emerged as high-capacity routes. Where Roman roads offered the most reliable line, across valleys, along river terraces, or via low passes, medieval traders and itinerant merchants would follow them. Market days, tolls, and fairs concentrated commerce in the same nodes. In many regions, the medieval road network was a palimpsest layered directly atop Roman alignments. You can still see it in maps, where a straighter-than-expected medieval track hints at an older design logic beneath. There are also the conspicuous cases of direct survival. In parts of Italy, southern France, and Spain, the Roman pavement literally survived and remained in use for centuries. Roman bridges in places like Alcantara and along the Loire lasted well into the medieval era. repaired and adapted by later engineers. Straight stretches of preserved paving, where basalt blocks or polygonal slabs still sit in place, continued to carry carts into the early modern period. In some roads, the grooves cut by millennia of iron rims and wooden wheels remained visible on the same stones that legions had trod. The physical durability of Roman engineering produced visible continuity. The Renaissance and early modern curiosity about antiquity added a different dynamic. Antiquarians, scholars, and traveling nobles began to notice and document ancient remains. For the first time since late antiquity, learned observers recorded the location of old roads, bridges, and milestones. Their itineraries and sketches reintroduced lost lines to the European imagination. That rediscovery mattered. Once an elite began to privilege the Roman past, the idea of restoration as a conscious act took root. Scholars argued for preserving and sometimes repairing ancient monuments. Rulers occasionally financed repairs on pragmatic grounds to reopen trade, and on symbolic grounds to be seen as restorers of past greatness.
The modern era gave the Roman roads yet another booster shot. As states centralized in the 17th to 19th centuries, governments built new roads in patterns that often echoed ancient logic. Administrators planning postal routes, military roads, or turnpike networks found Roman alignments useful because they already represented tested, practical choices about gradient, drainage, and node placement. In some places, the route chosen for a modern highway follows the same corridor first laid down by Roman surveyors. In others, earlier Roman masonry remained the best possible base for new surfaces. The Industrial Revolution's appetite for efficient logistics unintentionally validated Roman spatial choices. Archaeology, beginning as a discipline in the 18th and 19th centuries and reaching methodological maturity in the 20th, gave yet more life to Roman roads. Excavations exposed pavement layers, uncovered milestones, and revealed the systematic construction techniques Rome had used. By demonstrating that Roman roads were planned, durable, and integral to settlement, archaeologists helped shape heritage policies that sometimes protected corridors from further destruction. Today's conservation of Roman roads, whether preserving a cobbled stretch or a bridge arch, is part of a longer trajectory that values ancient infrastructure as cultural patrimony. Technological advances in archaeological survey have further revealed the invisible persistence of Roman lines. Methods like aerial photography, geophysical prospection, and more recently, LiDAR, reveal buried alignments beneath forest canopy and modern fields. Where erode stones have been removed, a subtle subsurface signature often remains. Different soil compaction, preserved cuttings, or linear accumulations of artifacts. These technological glimpses allow modern scholars, and now the public, to trace networks that were once considered lost. The pattern reappears on maps. Ghost lines aligning villages and monasteries, explaining why markets exist where they do, and why certain towns prospered across eras. Civic memory has also conserved roots. Place names, old charters, and local lore often carry the names of roads, mileages, or stations. A Stane Street or Old Watling in England, a Via in Italy, or Camí in Catalonia carries a linguistic echo of Roman transport. In some cases, historians could use those names and surviving folk knowledge to reconstruct alignments decades before excavation confirmed them physically. Oral tradition and documentary memory are therefore part of the road's survival story. People remember where they walked, and those memories accumulate into local histories that protect and transmit route knowledge. The Roman road's afterlife is also legal and institutional. Some roads remained under communal or royal obligation. Rights of way, maintenance obligations, and toll regimes persisted in different forms. In medieval Europe, for example, lordships and municipalities sometimes had the duty to repair bridges and causeways.
Legal records that mandated repair after floods or required levying tolls for maintenance often protected stretches of route by attaching enforceable responsibilities to them. Where law recognized a right of movement, the physical pathway had better prospects for survival. Perhaps the most human testament to endurance is the continuing pattern of human settlement. Towns sited at Roman crossroads often survived administrative collapse and re-emerged in medieval records. Urban morphology, a forum turned into a market square, a cardo and decumanus defining street grids, persisted in forms visible in modern mapping and city plans. These continuities shaped political life. Bishops and counts exercised power in towns whose centrality derived from older roads. In essence, Roman planning seeded a geography of authority that outlived emperors. Beyond Europe, the Roman road legacy extended culturally and technically. In the Byzantine East, Roman techniques and route logic underpinned medieval transportation. In North Africa, Roman alignments influenced settlement patterns that later Islamic polities encountered and adapted. The idea of engineered durability, the multi-layered pavement, drainage logic, and milestone demarcation remained a concept that later engineers drew from, whether consciously or through inherited practice. There is a final poetic truth to the survival of these roads. They endure because movement is human. People keep moving for food, faith, family, and profit. When a route reduces the cost of that movement, it becomes part of the minimum viable infrastructure of a society. The Roman roads had chosen, by engineering and law, corridors that minimized friction. Shallow gradients, reliable river crossings, and defensible junctions. Those choices are often geography's best answers to the practical problems every generation faces. Time may cover or repurpose the stones, but the logic remains. Walking today along one of those enduring lines, as travelers, historians, or filmmakers, you feel a continuity that is at once technical and emotional. You trace the gestures of surveyors 2 millennia removed. You follow a line chosen by calculation, then adopted by habit, then sanctified by ritual. You imagine carts creaking under amphora, monks copying manuscripts in roadside scriptoria, soldiers posted in forts, and pilgrims walking toward a distant shrine. The road's silence is heavy with these lives. Its stones are palimpsests of purpose. The roads that refused to die did so for reasons practical and poetic. They were well built, well located, socially useful, and culturally remembered. They were repaired by monasteries, reused in houses, chronicled by antiquarians, and occasionally restored by modern states. Technology now lets us see them again from the sky. Heritage law tries to protect what remains. Tourism turns them into sites of memory and commerce. But perhaps the deepest reason they persisted is human habit. Once a path makes life easier, people keep using it, and in doing so, keep the memory of the road alive. In this sense, the Roman road is not merely an ancient artifact. It is a living thread that binds epochs, the empire that forged it, the medieval qualities that adapted it, the modern nations that rediscovered it. Its survival is a lesson in continuity. Infrastructure shapes history as much as history shapes infrastructure. The roads that refuse to die remind us that the past is never entirely past. It lives under our feet, guiding where we choose to go next.
For centuries, the Roman road lay half-remembered, a faint line on a map, a field where a plow turned up dressed stone, a milestone quietly reused as a lintel above a village door. Then curiosity began to turn that half-remembering into inquiry. Rediscovery is both a physical process, excavation, survey, mapping, and an intellectual one. A question asked of landscape and artifact about who built these things, how they worked, and what people lived and died along them. In Part 9, we follow that rediscovery from antiquarian eyes to modern archaeology, and we watch the roads yield secrets that remake our understanding of the Roman world. The first wave of interest came not from scientists, but from travelers and gentlemen scholars. In the 17th and 18th centuries, as Europeans began to prize classical antiquity, the remains of Rome's roads began to attract attention as curiosities and tokens of a glorious past. Paintings, etchings, and travelogues described straight causeways seen from hilltops. Milestones were sketched and copied into albums. This antiquarian impulse was uneven, sentimental at times, methodical at others, but it did something historians and engineers later would thank. It preserved memory and sparked questions. A landowner finding a well-cut block in a field might note its inscription. A traveler sketching a ruined bridge would point out its arch. Those notes and drawings formed the first layer of archive for later discovery. As archaeology professionalized in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the study of Roman roads moved from admiration to method. Systematic excavations began to expose cross-sections of pavement, reveal construction layers, and recover organic evidence sealed in soil lenses. Archaeologists learned to read a road as a stratigraphic record, base stones telling of initial construction, repairs recorded as different masonry styles, adjoining ditches revealing changing hydrology, and roadside deposits, potsherds, animal bone, coins, giving us the rhythm of daily life. What appeared at first glance to be purely engineering became a social document. The road was not just a way to move, it was a place where people ate, traded, died, and commemorated. Material evidence is the world's truest witness. Milestones bearing imperial names clarified who funded what and when. Tablets and inscriptions turned miles into dates, and the anonymous builders into named officials. Where inscriptions survived, archaeologists could link a pavement layer to a reign, a governor, or an imperial building program. Small finds, brooches, amphora stamps, and fragments of leather sandals told us about movement, who traveled, with what goods, and from where. When a battlefield was discovered near a road, we learned how columns moved and how fragile tactical advantage could be. Roads became lenses through which historians could read logistics, administration, and even personal stories. Technological revolutions accelerated discovery. Aerial photography revealed linear soil marks invisible at ground level. Where a packed Roman subbase altered soil compaction, crops grew differently, leaving pale or dark stripes in a cultivated field. From the air, old alignments flashed on the landscape like fingerprints. Later, satellite imagery extended this view, allowing researchers to trace long-distance lines across modern infrastructure. Geophysical surveys, magnetometry, and resistivity allowed teams to detect stones without a spade. Ground-penetrating radar could outline foundations and culverts. Then, LiDAR, the laser scanning technology that slices through forest canopy, transformed archaeology in wooded regions. Ancient causeways that had vanished beneath trees suddenly reappeared as pale scars in topographic models. Forested sections of frontier roads and hidden Roman routes in upland zones were remapped with unprecedented clarity.
These tools did more than locate roads. They changed what archaeologists could ask. No longer were investigators forced to destroy a site to know its plan. Non-invasive surveys produced high-resolution maps that guided targeted excavations. Combined with Geographic Information Systems, or GIS, scholars began to model road networks as systems, analyzing connectivity, accessibility, and travel time catchments. Questions shifted from where was the road to how did the road alter patterns of settlement, economy, and control. Network analysis could show how a new road corridor reoriented markets, reduced travel times, and created new centers of gravity in the landscape. The road, once a static object, became a dynamic actor in long-term historical processes. Fieldwork also returned human stories. Excavations at roadside settlements and military stations uncovered evidence of everyday life that is striking in its intimacy. Pottery assemblages tell us what people ate. Animal bones reveal diet and pastoral practices. Seeds and pollen show how the surrounding agriculture changed with the road's arrival. Inscriptions and graffiti, often scratched on stones at rest stops and forts, provide voices across centuries. Names, professions, jokes, curses. At Vindolanda and other frontier sites, delicate wooden tablets with personal letters, requests for socks to be sent home, supply lists, casual notes, make the soldier who used the road suddenly recognizable as a person with longing, obligation, and humor. These human traces transform the road from engineering feat into biography. Rediscovery also reshaped modern national and regional identities. In the 19th and 20th centuries, nations looking for historical continuity found it in Roman infrastructure. Roman roads provided a narrative of deep roots, a framework on which modern states could anchor ancient prestige. The presence of a Roman causeway near a town became a civic asset, a mark of antiquity that tourism services and local museums could display. In some cases, the conservation of Roman roads inspired early heritage laws. In others, modern development threatened them. The tension between preservation and progress continues to be a central issue in road archaeology. When a highway must be built across a suspected Roman alignment, what value is assigned to buried stone against contemporary mobility? That question points to an ethical strand in rediscovery, the challenge of balancing archaeology and community needs. Excavations can slow construction, divert funds, and disrupt local economies, but they can also bring jobs, educate residents, and generate tourism income. Heritage management increasingly recognizes that roads are not only scientific data sets, but living parts of communities. Successful projects combine careful excavation with public engagement. Open days at dig sites, local exhibitions, and the inclusion of volunteers. Community archaeology, projects that train and employ local people in recording and conserving road remains, has become an important model for making rediscovery inclusive rather than extractive. Rediscovery has also illuminated darker sides of the past: looting, illicit trade in antiquities, and the destruction of contexts. Milestones and carved stones have been stolen, sold, and lost to private collections, erasing the context that gives them meaning. Development pressures, quarrying, road upgrades, and urban expansion have obliterated stretches of pavement beyond recovery. These losses have spurred legal protection regimes, UNESCO listings, and local conservation laws. The recognition that Roman roads are part of global heritage has mobilized international funding for preservation and research, and it has encouraged databases that record known alignments, fines, and condition assessments. One of the most exciting outcomes of modern rediscovery is the reconnection of dispersed datasets. Roman road research used to be fragmented. A local antiquarian's notes in one library, a 19th century sketch in another, a modern LiDAR strip in a national archive. Today, digital humanities projects aggregate these resources. Open access databases, digitized milestone catalogs, and crowdsourced mapping allow scholars and citizens alike to visualize the entire network at once. Scholars can overlay ancient itineraries with modern roads, compare inscriptions across provinces, and model the speed of travel under different conditions. These synthetic approaches have led to surprising insights: the sheer density of certain corridors, the pace at which markets formed, and even the ways seasonal patterns such as river flooding shaped route choice. Rediscovery has also influenced modern engineering and conservation practice. Conservators grappling with exposed pavements must balance stabilizing original fabric with making sites legible and accessible. Techniques range from reburial to full conservation.
Each decision involves trade-offs between longevity and public interpretation. In some cases, reusing Roman masonry in sympathetic restoration can preserve the fabric. In others, keeping original stones in situ is the priority. Advances in material science, consolidants, reversible bonding agents, and environmental monitoring now allow conservators to intervene more subtly than in earlier eras when preservation sometimes meant unwanted alteration. The archaeological narrative is also enriched by interdisciplinary collaboration. Historians reading ancient texts, itineraries, geographers, and administrative records now work hand in hand with archaeologists and remote sensing specialists. Environmental scientists contribute paleoecology and geomorphology to explain why a road took one line rather than another. Engineers reconstruct cross-sections to test hypotheses about load-bearing capacity and longevity. The result is a fuller, more nuanced picture. Roman roads become not only monuments, but systems embedded in topography, climate, labor regimes, and institutional arrangements. Rediscovery has given the roads contemporary resonance in unexpected ways. Planners studying sustainable transport sometimes look back at Roman principles, durability, maintenance regimes, and the importance of nodes as timeless lessons about resilience. Heritage routes are integrated into cycling paths and cultural itineraries, offering pedagogical and economic value. The image of the milestone has become a metaphor in public discourse for connectivity, markers that assert presence, measure distance, and hold memory. Perhaps the most profound outcome of archaeological work is intellectual humility. The more we discover, the more complex the Roman world appears. Roads are not monolithic impositions, but negotiated infrastructures, built by soldiers and local laborers, funded by emperors and municipal bodies, used by merchants and pilgrims, repaired by monks and looters alike. Rediscovery peels back the imperial gloss to reveal a layered human story, ambition and engineering, but also adaptation, reuse, and the messy persistence of ordinary lives.
In the end, rediscovery transforms silence into conversation. A stone pulled from soil asks questions about dates, sources, and lives. A map stitched from LiDAR and archive reveals corridors that link communities across time. Archaeology does not merely unearth, it interprets and shares. Each excavated road invites us to listen to the footsteps that once determined trade and governance, to the petitions and prayers carried along a path, to the small acts of maintenance and neglect that shaped destinies. Rediscovery returns the road to the public imagination not as relic, but as story, a story that helps us understand how human beings built, inhabited, and eventually remembered the lines that connected their world. As we begin to walk those lines again, guided by maps and satellites, we do more than chart ruins. We re-enter a landscape of choices. Why this valley? Why that crossing? Why a mile's spacing between way stations? Rediscovery is the act of reading those choices back into light. The archaeological wonder of Roman roads is not only in the stones themselves, but in what they teach us about how infrastructure shapes history, how routes become lifelines, how maintenance becomes permanence, and how a paved line across a field can be the archive of an empire.
At dusk, the old road glows with a faint warmth, its stones holding the last light of day. The air is still, and the world feels momentarily ancient again, as if the centuries between Rome and now have folded in upon themselves. You can almost hear it, the rhythm of sandals striking stone, the murmur of Latin orders, the creak of wooden wheels. Then silence returns, and the realization settles in. What endures is not the empire that built the road, but the impulse that conceived it. Rome's roads were never only about distance.
They were about connection. The idea that geography could be tamed, that human effort could carve order into chaos. Across mountains, deserts, and frontiers, these lines of stone turned isolation into conversation. They carried legions, yes, but also letters of love, news of birth, contracts of trade, and songs of faith. They made it possible for millions of strangers to share one system, one time, one world. When Rome fell, the roads did not vanish. They changed hands. Monks walked where legions marched. Pilgrims followed where soldiers once camped, and merchants crossed where emperors once ruled. The empire died, but its arteries continued to pulse under new skins: Christian, feudal, industrial, modern. The Roman road outlived Rome because it answered something universal: the human need to move, to connect, to belong to something larger than the horizon. Even now, the logic of those stones shapes our modern world. Highways follow their lines. Cities trace their intersections. Every satellite map of Europe still bears the ghost of the Roman network, faint but indelible. What was once carved by hand is now traced by tire and track, by fiber optic cable and flight path. We are still walking the Roman dream to make the world smaller, to draw people closer. Perhaps that is why standing on a Roman road feels different from standing anywhere else. It is not just history beneath your feet, it is continuity. These stones have outlasted kingdoms, creeds, and languages, yet they remain faithful to their first promise: to lead from one human heart to another. The empire's banners have turned to dust, its emperors to memory, but its roads, the silent witnesses of all that was, still stretch across the land like threads of eternity. They remind us that the measure of civilization is not the height of its walls, but the reach of its roads. For as long as people seek to meet, to trade, to learn, or to believe, as long as we keep walking toward one another, the roads of Rome will never truly end. They live on in every journey we take.